My wedding ring was never just a piece of jewelry. It has always meant so much more than just a symbol of marriage. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains of my bedroom in Sierra Vista, I would turn my hand, watching the light play on an antique sapphire framed by tiny diamonds. At times like that, I felt like Albert was still here, right beside me. My name is Yvonne Hazelwood. I am 73 years old, and for the past 2 years, I have lived alone in our family home on a quiet street in Sierra Vista. Albert died of a heart attack on a warm April evening. He had just finished pruning the rose bushes in the garden, the activity he loved most. I found him lying among my favorite flowers. A quiet death, the doctor said. He probably didn't even have time to feel anything. Our house is 2 stories, with 4 bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a veranda that wraps around the perimeter of the building. We bought it 40 years ago when Albert got a job as chief engineer at the local mining plant. We thought it was too big for a family of 3, but Albert always said, "Yvonne, this house is our future. Imagine our grandchildren running around here." He was an optimist, my Albert. However, we still only had one child, our son Percy, who chose a career over family and moved to Philadelphia right out of college. He worked at a law firm specializing in corporate law and visited us infrequently, at Christmas and sometimes Thanksgiving if he wasn't too busy. We never got grandchildren. The ring came to me from Albert's mother, Esther Hazelwood, shortly before we were married. "In our family, this ring passes from mother to daughter-in-law," she said, placing the jewelry in my palm. My mother-in-law gave it to me when I married George, Albert's father. Before that, it belonged to her mother-in-law. The story of the ring was connected to a love story that began in the late 19th century. Albert's great-great-grandfather, Thomas Hazelwood, was an English immigrant who came to America in search of fortune. In Boston, he met Abigail Stillwood, the daughter of a successful cloth merchant. It was love at first sight, but Abigail's father disapproved of the poor immigrant. Then Thomas vowed to make himself worthy of her hand. He traveled west, where he found work in the silver mines. 3 years later, he returned to Boston with this very ring, which he ordered from the best jeweler in San Francisco. The sapphire symbolized Thomas's loyalty, and the diamonds symbolized the stars that led him back to his beloved. Albert knew the story by heart and often told it to Percy when he was a boy. But our son never seemed to take much interest in family heirlooms or stories. He always looked forward, never backward. When Percy was 26, he married Jillian Pembroke, a woman he met at a law firm. She worked in public relations and had a reputation for being ambitious and driven. Albert and I met her just a month before we were to be married, in a modest ceremony at Philadelphia's City Hall. Then I had the thought of offering her a ring, continuing a family tradition, but something stopped me. Perhaps the coldness in her eyes as she looked at our old-fashioned house, or the way she subtly wrinkled her nose as she tasted my signature applesauce. Either way, I kept the ring, deciding it wasn't time yet. The years passed, and I saw Jillian only a handful of times, at the rare family reunions that grew shorter and more formal. Percy grew distant, as if in a hurry to get back to his busy life in the big city. And then Albert died, and I was left alone in a house that was suddenly too big and too quiet. Percy came to the funeral, stayed 2 days and left, citing important business. Jillian didn't even come, sending a bouquet of lilies and a condolence card. Life without Albert was slow and monotonous. I continued tending his roses, socializing with neighbors, and going to the local knitting club. Occasionally, I worked part-time as a proofreader for the local newspaper, a profession I had practiced before Percy was born. My life was quiet, but I found my rhythm and peace in it. That all changed last spring when Percy called me in the middle of the night. His voice sounded strained, almost frightened. "Mom, we're in trouble," he said without preamble. "The firm had gone bankrupt. I've been laid off. Jillian and I have no savings. We could lose our apartment." I listened to his rambling account of the corporate scandal, how the firm's partners had disappeared with client money, leaving the rank and file to deal with the fallout, about how she and Jillian were mired in loans, trying to maintain a certain lifestyle. "We thought about moving to another city, starting over," Percy said. "But now we don't even have the money to move." I knew what he was getting at before he even made the request. "Can we stay with you? Just for a little while until we get back on our feet?" My heart squeezed with a mixture of joy and anxiety. On the one hand, the thought of Percy's presence filled me with hope. On the other, I remembered Jillian's cold stare. Of course, I said without thinking. It's a big house. There's plenty of room for everyone. They arrived a week later in a rented truck full of boxes of their belongings. Jillian looked exhausted and irritated. Her once perfect hair was carelessly gathered into a ponytail, and her expensive clothes were wrinkled. Percy seemed depressed, his shoulders slumped, and there was a shadow in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. I showed them to the guest bedroom on the second floor, a spacious room with windows overlooking the garden. Jillian gave it a critical look. The wallpaper is so vintage, she said, running her finger over the floral pattern Albert and I had chosen back in the 80s. We could repaint it, Percy interjected quickly. Right, Mom? Freshen up the room. I smiled and nodded, though the thought of changing anything in the house Albert and I had created together made me uncomfortable. They won't last long, I reminded myself. The first few weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Percy was job hunting, spending hours on the computer and on phone interviews. Jillian spent most of her time in her bedroom, surfing social media and sighing about her lost life in Philadelphia. I tried not to interfere, giving them space to adjust. By the end of the first month, Percy had found a temporary job as a consultant at a small law firm in Sierra Vista. The salary was considerably less than in Philadelphia, but it was a step forward. Jillian refused to even consider local jobs, considering them unworthy of her qualifications. There's nothing for a public relations professional in this backwater, she complained over dinner. You can't even find decent coffee here. I silently served her salad, reminding myself that she was going through a difficult time. The atmosphere in the house was getting tenser by the day. Jillian began to make changes, first minor ones, like rearranging the living room furniture or changing the curtains. Then more significant ones, like throwing out the collection of porcelain figurines that Albert and I had collected over the years, calling them old-fashioned junk. Percy didn't confront her, only cast apologetic glances at me when he thought Jillian couldn't see. One evening, about 3 months after their arrival, I was sitting on the veranda going through old photographs. Among them was a wedding picture of Albert and me. Me in a simple white dress, him in a dark suit, both young and happy. I already had the sapphire ring on my hand. Jillian came out onto the veranda with a glass of wine and sat down next to me. Her gaze fell on the photograph. What a beautiful ring, she said, leaning closer. Is that the one you're still wearing? I nodded, twisting the ring on my finger. It's been in Albert's family for 5 generations. It must be worth a fortune, she said, and there was a note in her voice that I couldn't quite place. It's not the cost, I replied. Its value is in the history it holds. Jillian shrugged and sipped her wine. History doesn't pay the bills these days, she said. If we had something like this, Percy and I wouldn't be in this situation. I remained silent, but I shuddered inwardly at her words. That night, when I went to bed, I stared at the ring for a long time, remembering all the moments associated with it. Albert's proposal, Percy's birth, our anniversaries. I couldn't imagine my hand without it. The next morning, I noticed Jillian staring at my ring during breakfast. Her gaze was appraising, as if she was mentally estimating its value. When our eyes met, she quickly averted her gaze and smiled a little too broadly. It's a beautiful day today, isn't it? She said, changing the subject. That day was the first time I noticed the atmosphere in my own home changing. It was as if an invisible shadow had cast itself over it, bringing with it a sense of unease and uncertainty. Things began to disappear. First little things, like the silver teaspoons I had inherited from my grandmother. Then more significant items, the brooch Albert had given me for our 20th anniversary, disappeared from my jewelry box. When I asked Percy about it, he looked confused. Mom, are you sure you didn't put them somewhere else? You know, at your age, your memory can fail you. His words hurt me more than the missing items. Does my own son think I'm old and forgetful? In the evenings, when I was already in bed, I could hear the muffled voices of Percy and Jillian from their room. They were arguing, often and intensely. Sometimes I heard my name whispered, followed by Jillian's sharp reply. Months passed, and what should have been a temporary solution turned into a permanent situation. Percy continued to work at a local firm, but made no move to find his own place. Jillian found a remote job at an advertising agency, but spent most of her time wandering around the house and criticizing everything from my way of making coffee to the color of the towels in the bathroom. I felt my space shrinking with each passing day. The garden, which had been my refuge after Albert's death, was now the only place I could be alone. I spent hours among the roses, talking to my husband's ghost, asking his advice. "What should I do, Albert?" I whispered, touching the petals of his favorite roses. "This is our son, but I don't recognize him. And this woman, she's changing him, changing our home." One evening, almost 6 months after they arrived, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. I was coming down the stairs to get a glass of water when I heard Jillian's voice from the living room. "It's a family heirloom, Percy. By all rights, it should belong to you, which means it should belong to me." "Mama will never give that ring away," Percy replied. "You know what it means to her." "She's an old woman." Jillian sounded annoyed. "How long will she have to wear it? And then what? Will she take it with her to the grave?" I froze on the stairs, feeling the blood rush to my face with anger and pain. "I can't just ask her to give me the ring." Percy's voice sounded uncertain. "Then don't ask," Jillian replied quietly but firmly. "Just take it. She won't even notice if we replace it with something similar." I didn't listen any further. I went back to my room, trembling with shock and betrayal. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night, repeating Jillian's words to myself. My wedding ring, the symbol of 50 years of love and fidelity. They wanted to steal it from me, from my own mother. That night, I locked my bedroom door for the first time. After that conversation, I watched Percy and Jillian more closely. I locked the bedroom door and hid the ring at night in a little box that I kept under the floorboard at the head of my bed, a secret that only Albert knew about. Maybe it seemed paranoid, but Jillian's words never left my mind. Summer came, hot and sweltering. Sierra Vista was a hot frying pan, the asphalt melting in the midday sun and the air conditioners running at full blast. My old cooling system could barely keep up, and Jillian was always complaining about it. "This house is unbearable," she said over breakfast, fanning herself with a magazine. "How do people live in this climate?" "They get used to it," I said, pouring cold tea into glasses. "It's harder to take the heat at my age, but I've learned to cope." Jillian rolled her eyes. "Percy, we need to install a proper air conditioner. This museum piece doesn't work." Percy, who had been looking tired all the time lately, just shrugged his shoulders. "Jill, we don't have extra money for a new air conditioner. Or maybe your mom does." Jillian threw me an appraising look. It was her house, after all, and she should be the one to take care of it. I took a sip of tea, trying to stay calm. "A new air conditioner is expensive, Jillian. I have a fixed retirement income, and I have to plan for the expense." "Of course," Jillian grinned. "It's a savings, I've noticed." Percy stepped in, trying to lighten the mood. "I'll look for used options. Maybe I'll find something reasonably priced." Jillian snorted and walked out of the kitchen, leaving us alone. Percy sighed and rubbed his temples. "I'm sorry, Mom. She's just not used to these conditions." "What conditions, Percy? A normal house with a roof over her head?" He looked at me reproachfully. "Don't start, please. It's hard enough as it is." I felt a pang of guilt. Indeed, they had lost a lot. A job with a good salary, an apartment in an upscale neighborhood, status. For Jillian, who had always attached great importance to material things, it must be especially painful. "I understand," I said more gently. "But this is my home, Percy, and it's not easy for me to get used to change either." He nodded, but I could see the detachment in his eyes. It was as if he'd heard my words, but hadn't taken them in. That detachment was becoming more noticeable every day. The son I had once known was fading away, disappearing into the shadow of his wife. A few days later, I found someone going through my jewelry box. Nothing was missing, probably because I had already hidden the most valuable things, but the order had been disturbed. The little pearl earrings that were always on the left were on the right, and the box was in the wrong place. When I asked Jillian about it, she feigned surprise. "Why do you think it was me?" Her voice sounded insulted, but her eyes remained cold. "Maybe you moved the things yourself and forgot?" Again, the innuendo about my age and supposed forgetfulness. I was beginning to tire of these tactics. I know where and how I keep my things, Jillian, I said firmly. And I'm not accusing you. I'm just asking if you've been in my room. Why would I want your old jewelry? She laughed, but the laugh sounded fake. I have my own. I didn't continue this pointless conversation, but that same evening I changed the lock on my bedroom door. My relationship with Percy was becoming increasingly strained. He was either silent, absorbed in his own thoughts, or irritable over nothing. When I tried to talk to him, he dismissed me as tired or urgent. One day I found him in Albert's office, which was now his workplace. He was sitting at his desk, staring into space. He had an open folder of papers in front of him, but it was obvious he wasn't working. Percy? I entered the room cautiously. Is everything all right? He flinched as if snapped out of a deep reverie. Yes, of course, I was just thinking about something. I sat down in the chair across from him. We were silent for a while. Finally, I made up my mind. Son, I'm worried about you. You don't look happy. Percy ran his hand over his face. I'm fine, Mom. It's just a lot of work. It's not just work, is it? I leaned forward. Is there something going on between you and Jillian? His gaze became detached. Mom, please don't start. Our marriage is our business. I know it is. But you're my son, and I can see that you're suffering. I'm not suffering. He suddenly raised his voice. Why do you always have to be so dramatic? We're just going through a difficult time, that's all. Percy, I'm trying to help. You don't need to help, he interrupted. You've already helped by letting us live here. We'll figure out the rest on our own. There was a coldness in his voice that made me recoil. This wasn't my Percy, not the boy I'd raised. Something or someone had changed him into a hard, detached man. Whatever you say. I stood up, tears welling up in my eyes. But know that I'm always ready to listen. He didn't answer, staring down at his papers again. I left the room quietly, wondering when and how I'd lost touch with my only child. July turned to August, and the heat became almost unbearable. Jillian spent most of her time at the mall, enjoying the air-conditioned air and making purchases that she and Percy obviously couldn't afford. Every evening, she would return with new packages, explaining to Percy that it was absolutely necessary, or such a discount that it was silly not to buy. I watched as my son nodded and smiled, not arguing with her, though there was anxiety in his eyes. Their financial situation wasn't improving. Percy's salary at the local firm was modest, and Jillian was spending more than they could afford. One day, while helping to clean their room, Jillian rarely bothered to do housework, I happened to find some credit statements. The amounts owed were staggering. How could they have accumulated so much in just a few months? And to make matters worse, some of the bills were addressed in my name. I waited until evening when Percy returned from work. Jillian had gone to visit a friend in a neighboring town and wasn't due back until the next day, a rare opportunity to talk to her son alone. Percy, I placed the statements on the kitchen table. What are these? He looked at the papers and turned pale. Where did you find them? In your room when I was cleaning? Percy, this is my name. Did you make the loans out to me? He lowered his eyes, and that was answer enough. We were desperate, Mom. Jillian needed money for medical treatment. She had thyroid problems. I couldn't believe my ears. So you decided to use my name without my consent? That's fraud, Percy. You're a lawyer, you should know. I was going to pay it all off before you found out. His voice sounded pathetic. Jillian said it was a temporary measure. Jillian said. I shook my head. Couldn't you have thought of that yourself? You're jeopardizing my house, my pension. I know, Mom, and I'm sorry. But what was I supposed to do? She needed treatment. I looked at him carefully. What kind of treatment, Percy? I hadn't seen Jillian take any medication or see a doctor. I had seen her coming back with bags from the boutiques, though. Percy was silent, avoiding my gaze. In that moment, I realized that he knew. Knew Jillian was lying, but he preferred not to confront her. I'll close those loans, he finally said. I promise, and I'll never do it again. I nodded tiredly. What else could I do? Report my own son to the police? Percy, you need to start looking for your own place, I said quietly. I love you, but this can't go on forever. I know, Mom. We're working on it. but I could see in his eyes that it wasn't true. They had no plans to move out. My house, my sanctuary, had become a trap. After that conversation, Percy became even more withdrawn. He avoided being alone with me, coming home late and leaving early. Jillian, on the other hand, became unusually friendly. She cooked dinner, though her culinary talents left much to be desired, inquired about my health, even suggested we go shopping together. This sudden change alarmed me more than her previous open hostility. There was something predatory in her smile, and her gaze kept stopping on my left hand, where a sapphire ring glittered. "What a marvelous ring," she said one day when we were drinking tea together on the veranda. "Do you never take it off?" "Almost never," I answered, turning the ring on my finger. "Only when I'm working in the garden or doing the dishes." "And where do you put it then?" Her voice sounded careless, but her eyes glittered with greedy interest. "On a shelf above the sink," I lied. In fact, I always kept it in my apron pocket, wrapped tightly in a handkerchief. Jillian nodded, and a smile flashed across her face that I didn't like at all. "Had you ever thought of inheriting it?" she asked, taking a sip of tea. "It's a family tradition, isn't it?" "I haven't decided yet," I said evasively. "But traditionally, the ring is passed from mother-in-law to daughter-in-law when she is sure she is worthy of wearing it." Jillian flinched, catching the hidden meaning of my words. "And you don't think I'm worthy?" Her voice became steely. I looked her straight in the eye. "I think we both know the answer to that question, Jillian." She stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the cup. "You never accepted me," her voice shook with anger. "From the beginning, you looked down on me, thinking me not good enough for your precious son." "You're wrong." I remained calm. "I gave you a chance. I opened my home. And how did you repay me? Loans in my name, stolen goods, disrespect?" "Stolen goods?" she laughed. "Are you accusing me of stealing? Maybe you just forgot where you put your trinkets." "There's that trick again." I shook my head. "It's not working, Jillian. I remember exactly where and what I keep." She snorted and left, slamming the door. I was left sitting on the veranda looking at Albert's roses and wondering how things had gotten to this state. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard loud voices coming from Percy and Jillian's room. They were arguing not for the first time, but this time they sounded especially fierce. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but when I heard my name, I stopped at their door. "She'll never give it up willingly," Jillian shouted. "Did you see the way she looked at me today? She hates me." "She's my mother, Jill." Percy's voice sounded tired. "She gave us a roof over our heads when we needed one. And she reminds us of that all the time." Jillian snorted. "Every day I feel unwelcome here. In her eyes, I'll always be not good enough for you." "That's not true." "Yes, it is. And this ring is just more proof. She'll never let me wear it, not even after she's dead. She'd rather bequeath it to some museum." "Jill, please calm down." "Don't tell me to calm down." Jillian's voice broke into a scream. "Do you know how much that ring is worth? We could solve all our problems in one fell swoop." I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart pounding hard. They didn't just want the ring to continue the tradition, they planned to sell it. "We can't just take the ring away from Mom," Percy's voice sounded uncertain. "It's stealing." "It's not stealing, it's returning a family heirloom to the rightful heir," Jillian countered. "You're her only son. By all laws, that ring belongs to you. But Mama's alive and the ring belongs to her." "She's old, Percy. How long will she have to wear it? And we're in a crisis. We could lose everything." "I can't, Jill. It's not right." There was a pause. Then Jillian's voice became softer, more seductive. "Percy, darling, think of us, about our future. We're stuck in this hole, living on your mother's handouts. Is that really what you wanted? Remember what our life was like in Philadelphia? We can get it all back." "How? By selling Mom's ring?" "Not Mom's ring, your family's. And yes, by selling it or pawning it. It'll give us a chance to start over. We'll get a job in the big city, get an apartment, buy the ring back. Your mother won't even know." "She'll notice it's missing." Percy's voice sounded less confident. "Not if we replace it with a similar one," Jillian insisted. "I know a jeweler who can make a copy for a small fortune. Not as expensive, of course, but almost identical in appearance." "I don't know." "Percy," Jillian's voice became hard. "I can't live like this any longer. If you won't do this for us, I'll leave. I'll go back to my parents without you." "You can't just leave." Percy's voice sounded fearful. We're married. A marriage can be dissolved, Jillian said coldly. And then you'll be alone in this godforsaken town, with a job that's killing you and a mother who'll control your every move for the rest of your life. There was a long pause. I stood there, breathless, unable to believe that my own son could consider such a possibility. Okay, Percy finally said, so quietly that I could barely hear. I'll do it, but we have to be careful. She usually takes the ring off at night and puts it in a box. No, she doesn't, Jillian objected. I checked. She hides it somewhere, but she always wears it during the day, so… What? Maybe we should wait until she's asleep, Jillian suggested. She takes sleeping pills, right? She's a heavy sleeper. You could just go in and take the ring off her finger. Jill, It's the only way, Percy. It's either the ring or me. Make up your mind. I recoiled from the door, feeling nauseous. My own son, my Percy, was discussing how to steal my most prized possession from me while I slept. I quietly went back to my room, locked the door, and sat on my bed for a long time, looking at the ring Albert had put on my finger over 50 years ago. What happened to our boy, Albert? I mentally asked. How could he have changed so much? But deep in my heart, I knew the answer. Percy had always been weak, too easily influenced. In high school, he'd followed strong personalities. In college, he'd followed fashion trends. And now he was following Jillian, a woman to whom material possessions meant more than family ties. I didn't take sleeping pills that night. Instead, I sat by the window, looking up at the stars and thinking about what I should do next. I couldn't continue to live in fear in my own home, for fear that my son would walk in at night to steal from me. The decision came with the dawn, as the first rays of sunlight touched Albert's roses in the garden. I knew what I must do. It would be painful, but necessary, for me and ultimately for Percy too. Sometimes the greatest love shows itself in the hardest decisions. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night, the thought of my upcoming conversation with Percy and Jillian keeping me awake. At about 3 a.m, I fell into a restless sleep, filled with disturbing visions. I dreamed of Albert, standing among his roses and looking sadly at the house, as if he were saying goodbye to it. I tried to call out to him, but my voice would not listen. I woke up to bright sunlight hitting my eyes. I usually pulled the curtains in the morning, but yesterday I'd been too upset to remember. The clock read almost 9, unusually late for me. I'd always been an early bird, loving to greet the dawn with a cup of coffee on the veranda, listening to the birds sing. As I stretched, I felt something strange. Something was wrong with my left arm. It felt unusually light, as if invisible shackles had been removed from it. I brought my hand to my eyes and froze in horror. My ring was gone. At first, I thought it was a dream, a nightmare I was about to wake up from. I rubbed my eyes, blinked a few times, but reality didn't change. The finger that had been wearing a sapphire ring for more than 50 years was empty. Only a faint stripe of skin, a mark from years of wearing the jewelry, reminded me that the ring had once been there. Panic gripped me for the first few seconds. I began frantically groping the bed, looking under the pillow, under the mattress. Maybe the ring had slipped in my sleep, but deep inside I knew the truth. It hadn't slipped. It had been removed. Percy had done what he and Jillian had talked about yesterday. I pulled out the drawer of the bedside table where I kept the little box of sleeping pills. It was open, though I remembered exactly that I hadn't taken a pill before bed. They'd slipped me sleeping pills, probably in the tea that Jillian had so insistently offered me before bed. "It'll help you relax," she'd said with fake concern in her voice. How naive I'd been, gullible, blind. Putting on my robe, I walked out of the bedroom. The house was strangely quiet. Usually at this time, Percy was eating breakfast before work, and Jillian was in the kitchen, rattling the dishes and turning the TV up to full volume. But today it was quiet, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for a storm. I walked down the stairs, holding onto the banister tighter than usual. The effects of the sleeping pills were still being felt. My head felt heavy and my movements clumsy. There was no one in the kitchen, just 2 cups of coffee on the table. So they'd already gotten up, had breakfast, and gone somewhere. Or maybe they'd run off with my ring. The thought made me furious in a way I hadn't been in years. I went through the kitchen and into the living room, then looked into Albert's study. No one was there. Maybe they were still asleep. It was Sunday, Percy wasn't working, and they were often in bed before noon. I went back up to the second floor and went to their door. I knocked and there was no answer. I knocked harder, then pushed the door, which was unlocked. The room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn. On the bedside table was Jillian's makeup bag and a few magazines. Everything looked normal, like they'd just stepped out for a minute and would be back soon. I was about to leave when I noticed something shiny on Jillian's dressing table. As I stepped closer, I felt my heart clench with pain and anger. There, among the cheap costume jewelry and perfume bottles, lay my ring. They hadn't even bothered to hide it. Perhaps Jillian was trying it on in front of the mirror, admiring the sapphire glittering on her finger. With trembling hands, I took the ring. It felt warm, like someone had just taken it off. I slipped it onto my finger, and the familiar heaviness returned, bringing a strange relief. Only now that the ring was back where it belonged did I realize how uncomfortable I'd been without it. I walked out of their room, carefully closing the door behind me. A storm of emotions raged inside me. Rage, anger, disappointment, the pain of betrayal. But on top of it all was an icy, clear realization. This couldn't go on. I sat down at the table in the kitchen and stared out the window at Albert's garden for a long time. The roses were in full bloom, their bright heads nodding in the breeze. "What would you do, Albert?" I asked mentally. "What would you do with our son who has grown so weak and wimpy?" The answer didn't come immediately, but when it did, I knew it was the right decision. Hard, painful, but necessary. I pulled a piece of paper and a pen from my desk drawer. My hands no longer trembled as I wrote a short note. "Percy and Jillian, I know what you've done. I'm giving you 2 weeks to find another place to live. After that time frame, you will have to move out, whether you find a new place or not. Yvonne Hazelwood." I reread the note. It seemed too dry, even cruel. But what else could I say? That my own son had betrayed me, stolen the thing most precious to me while I slept? That the woman he'd chosen as his life partner had manipulated him into a thief and a liar? That I no longer felt safe in my own home? No, I'd rather have it that way. Short and to the point. I placed the note on the center of the kitchen table, pressing it down with the sugar bowl so they'd be sure to notice. Then I went up to my room, changed my clothes, and left the house. I needed to be alone, away from these walls that had seen so much pain. I spent the day in the city park, sitting on a bench by the pond and watching the ducks. They swam in circles, sometimes coming up to the shore in hopes of a treat. Life went on around me. Children laughing, couples holding hands, older men playing chess on special tables. Just an ordinary Sunday afternoon in Sierra Vista. It wasn't until the sun began to sink that I decided to head home. On the way, I stopped at a small store and bought a door lock. If Percy and Jillian decided to ignore my demand, I needed to be prepared to defend myself. As I approached the house, I noticed that there were lights on in the windows. That means they're back. Did they find my note? How did they react? Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, spend the night with my neighbor Martha, with whom we sometimes played bridge. But I couldn't avoid confrontation forever. This was my home, and I wasn't going to let myself be kicked out of it. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage, and opened the front door. It was dark in the hallway, but there were voices coming from the kitchen. They were arguing. Jillian was almost shouting, and Percy was answering in a muffled voice, like he was afraid of being overheard. "She's bluffing," Jillian said. "She won't throw her only son out on the street." "You don't know my mother," replied Percy. "If she says she does, she does." "How?" "She slept like a dead woman." "You said yourself that she didn't even move when you took the ring off." I walked quietly down the hall and stopped at the kitchen door. They were sitting at the table, my note lying between them. Jillian was red with anger, and Percy looked pale and frightened. "Maybe she woke up in the morning and found it missing," he said. "Or saw the ring on your table." Jillian slapped her palm on the table. "I told you to hide it. Why did you put it in plain sight?" "I didn't," Percy objected. "You put it there." "I did not. I gave it to you as soon as you came back from her room. I decided I had heard enough, and I went into the kitchen." They were silent when they saw me, and their faces ranged from shock to fear. "Mom!" Percy jumped up from his chair. Can we explain? There's no need, I interrupted him, my voice calm, though I was seething inside. I heard everything. Last night, too. They exchanged frightened glances. Last night? Percy interjected. Yes, your conversation about taking the ring off my finger while I was asleep. And today I woke up without it. I raised my left hand, showing that the ring was back in place. As you can see, I found it. Jillian was the first to come to her senses. Her face took on an expression of feigned remorse. Yvonne, this is a terrible misunderstanding, she began in a sweet voice. We just wanted to make a copy of the ring to carry on the tradition. Percy is so proud of his heritage. That's enough, I cut her off. I overheard you two talking. You were planning to sell the ring or pawn it. And slip me a cheap fake. Percy lowered his eyes, unable to meet my gaze. Jillian continued to play the part. It's not true, Percy, tell her. But Percy remained silent, staring at the floor. Finally, he looked up and I saw tears in his eyes. Mother, I don't know what came over me. Forgive me, please. Percy! Jillian exclaimed. Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. I stole my mother's ring, he said quietly. How could that not be bad? Jillian snorted. It's a family ring. It belongs to the whole family. You have as much right to it as she does. I shook my head, feeling not so much anger as deep fatigue. The ring belongs to me, I said firmly. Albert put it on my finger on our wedding day. I decide who and when to give it to. She'll never give it to me. Jillian turned to Percy. You can see she hates me. I don't hate you, Jillian, I said calmly. I just see you for what you are, a woman ready to steal from an old woman while she sleeps. Yvonne, you've got it all wrong. No, I've got it right, I interrupted her. And my decision is final. You must move out within 2 weeks. Percy jumped up, his face contorted with despair. Mom, please don't do this. We can't move out now. We haven't any money. You'll find a way, I replied. You always find a way when it comes to getting something you want. Jillian suddenly changed tactics. Her face softened, her eyes filled with tears. Yvonne, I admit we've made a terrible mistake, but we're desperate. We have no jobs, no money. Where are we going to go? It's not my problem, I replied, surprised at my own firmness. You're adults. Sort it out yourselves. You're throwing us out on the street? Percy's voice shook. Your own son? The words hurt, but I didn't let my emotions get the best of me. I'm giving you 2 weeks to find a new place to live. That's more than generous, considering the circumstances. You can't do that! Jillian's face turned red with anger. We've been living here for almost a year. We have rights. You didn't sign any lease, I reminded her. You're guests here. Guests who have abused my hospitality. Jillian jumped up, knocking over a chair. You're going to regret this, she hissed. We'll tell everyone what you're really like. A cruel, selfish old woman who threw her own son out on the street. Jill, stop it. Percy put a hand on her shoulder, but she shook it off. No, let her know. Let everyone know. We'll write to the local paper. That's enough. My voice, quiet though it was, silenced her. You can say whatever you want, but the fact remains that you tried to steal from me, and now you have to leave. I turned to leave the kitchen, but Percy caught my arm. Mom, please. His voice shook. We won't do this again, I swear. Give us another chance. I looked at my son, at his frightened face, at the tears in his eyes. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to hug him, to tell him everything would be okay. But the other part, the stronger part, knew that would be a mistake. He wouldn't change as long as Jillian was around, or maybe he couldn't change at all. Maybe weakness of character was his essence and nothing would fix that. A chance for what, Percy? I asked quietly. To try to steal from me again? Or find another way to take advantage of me? No, Mother, I would never. You've already done that, I interrupted him. And if you were honest right now, you'd do it again if Jillian insisted. He didn't answer, and that was more eloquent than any words could say. 2 weeks, I repeated. No more. I released my hand from his grip and walked out of the kitchen. As I walked up the stairs, I heard Jillian screaming again, blaming Percy for everything and him trying to calm her down. Their voices followed me like an echo of everything that had gone wrong in my life. In my room, I locked the door and sat on my bed, looking at the ring on my finger. It looked the same as it always had, but now it carried a new story, a story of betrayal. The next few days passed in a strange, tense silence. Percy and Jillian avoided me, coming out of their rooms only when I wasn't home. I heard their footsteps, their muffled voices, but rarely saw them face to face. On the fourth day after the ring incident, I returned from my walk and found Percy waiting for me in the living room. He looked tired and depressed, as if he hadn't slept for several nights. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, standing up. I nodded and sat down in the chair across from him. "I'm listening." Percy took a deep breath. "Jillian and we're very sorry about what happened. It was wrong, and we understand that." I was silent, waiting for him to continue. "We want to stay," he said quietly. "We have nowhere to go, Mom. We don't have any money for rent, and Jillian's parents, well, they're not thrilled about our marriage, and they're not likely to accept us." "I'm sorry, Percy, but my decision won't change," I replied. "You have violated my trust. I no longer feel safe with you in the house." "Mom, please," his voice trembled. "We can fix this. I'll work more. We'll pay you rent." "It's not about the money." "Then what is it? Tell me, what can we do to make you forgive us?" I looked at my son, the boy I once held in my arms, the boy I taught to walk, to read, to be an honest man. Somewhere along the way, I had lost him. "Some things can't be fixed with a simple, 'I'm sorry,'" I said. "You planned to steal from me. Not in the heat of the moment, not out of desperation, but deliberately, cold-bloodedly. You slipped me sleeping pills. You took the ring off my hand while I was asleep. How can I trust you after that?" Percy lowered his head. "Jillian made it all up," he whispered. "I didn't mean to." "But you did," I interrupted him. "You could have said no. You could have stopped her. Instead, you chose to side with her against your mother. She's my wife, Mom, and I'm your mother, and you had to make a choice. You made it, and now you have to live with the consequences." At that moment, Jillian walked into the room. Her eyes were red from crying, her makeup smeared. She looked very different from her usual self. There was no arrogance or coldness in her gaze. "Yvonne," she stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I know you think the worst of me, and perhaps you're right. I have been a terrible daughter-in-law. But please don't punish Percy for my mistakes." I stared at her, surprised by this new tactic. Did she really think I would believe her remorse? "It wasn't just your mistakes, Jillian," I replied. "Percy made his own choices. Because I pressured him." She knelt down next to my chair and I pulled away involuntarily. "I manipulated him, threatened to leave if he didn't do what I wanted." Percy looked at his wife in amazement. "Jill?" "No, Percy. She needs to know the truth." Jillian turned to me, tears glistening in her eyes. "I was greedy, envious. I saw that ring and I only thought about how much it was worth, not what it meant to you. I'm a terrible person, Yvonne, but Percy is a good man. He deserves another chance." I watched this scene with growing bewilderment. Was this genuine remorse or another manipulation? With Jillian, one could never be sure. "Please, Yvonne." She took my hand and I could barely keep from yanking it away. "We'll do whatever you say. I'll get a job, any job. Percy will help more around the house. We'll pay the rent." I released my hand gently. "Jillian, I appreciate your, remorse. But my decision won't change. You both need to find another place to live." Her face changed, the mask of remorse slipping for a moment, and I saw anger and frustration behind it. But she quickly pulled herself together. "I understand," she said quietly. "You can't trust us, but maybe in time." "No, Jillian, not in time. Not in this house." She rose slowly from her knees, her eyes cold again. "All right, we'll leave as you wish, but know that you are destroying a family. Our family." I shook my head. "You're destroying the family with your actions. I'm just accepting the consequences." Jillian turned and walked out of the room, leaving Percy and I alone. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite make out, a mixture of resentment, anger, and perhaps understanding. "She's really sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "We're both sorry." "Perhaps," I replied. "But regret doesn't undo what you've done." Percy sighed and stood up. "We'll find somewhere else to go," he said, heading for the door. But I hope that one day you can forgive us. Forgive me. I didn't answer. When the door closed behind him, I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. I cried not so much for their betrayal, but for loss. The loss of the son I had once known and loved. The man he could have become had he made different choices. The next few days passed in tense silence. Percy and Jillian barely showed their faces to me, leaving their room only when I wasn't home or when I'd already gone to bed. I could hear their muffled voices, the sound of footsteps and closing doors, but we hardly ever came face to face. On the seventh day after the ring incident, I noticed some changes in their behavior. The kitchen was cleaner than usual. Someone, clearly not Jillian, judging by the way it was done, had cleaned the windows in the living room. The trash that usually accumulated outside their room was gone. They'd tried to make a good impression, to show they could change. It was too late. That same evening, I called my longtime friend and attorney, Gilbert Nivens. Gilbert had been a friend of Albert's since his high school days, and after my husband's death, he had often helped me with legal matters. I explained the situation without going into too much painful detail and asked him to come back tomorrow with the documents. "Are you sure, Yvonne?" he asked after I'd outlined my plan. "It's a big decision." "I'm absolutely sure, Gilbert," I replied. "I've been thinking about it for a long time. It's the right decision." He sighed. "Good. I'll prepare the documents and be there by 2 o'clock tomorrow. But think again before I arrive. Sometimes in anger we make decisions we regret." "It's not anger, Gilbert," I said quietly. "It's clarity." For the first time in a long time, I could see the situation for what it really was. After talking to Gilbert, I felt a strange calmness. It was as if the decision I'd made had lifted a heavy weight of uncertainty from my shoulders. I knew I was doing the right thing, even if it hurt. The next morning, I got up early, made myself a light breakfast, and drank a cup of coffee on the veranda, watching the waking garden. Albert's roses needed tending. A few bushes needed pruning, and some were starting to get sick. In the past, I would have asked Percy to help, but now I realized I had to learn to do it myself or hire someone. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, I heard Percy and Jillian's bedroom door open. Footsteps on the stairs, quiet voices in the kitchen. They hadn't expected me to be home. I usually went to the local knitting club on Thursdays, but today I'd canceled, expecting Gilbert to arrive. I walked into the kitchen as they were eating breakfast. Percy almost choked on his toast when he saw me, and Jillian was frozen with a cup of coffee to her mouth. "Good morning," I said, heading for the refrigerator. "Morning," Percy replied uncertainly. Jillian just nodded without looking at me. I took out the milk and calmly poured myself another cup of coffee. "Gilbert Nivens is coming to see me today," I said, turning to them. "I'd like you both home at 2 o'clock this afternoon." Percy tensed. "Gilbert? Your solicitor?" I nodded. "Why?" Jillian's voice sounded worried. "You'll find out at 2 o'clock, I said, and left the kitchen, leaving them to digest the information. At 2:30, the doorbell rang. Gilbert, always punctual, arrived even before the appointed time. I went down to meet him. Gilbert Nivens was a tall, thin man of 78, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and shrewd blue eyes. Despite his age, he retained the clarity of mind and firmness of character that had made him a successful lawyer. "Yvonne," he put his arm around me. "You look well, despite the circumstances." "Thank you, Gilbert. Come in, please." We went into the living room where I had already prepared tea and cookies. Gilbert took a file out of his briefcase. "Everything is ready as you asked," he said, laying out the papers on the table. "I only ask you to think about it again. This is a major change in your will." "I've been thinking about it all night," I replied. "My mind hasn't changed." He nodded, though I could see in his eyes that he was still questioning my choice. "Good. Then let's go through the paperwork before your guests join us." We spent the next half hour going over the details. Gilbert explained the legal aspects, and I listened attentively, occasionally asking questions. When the clock in the living room struck twice, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Percy and Jillian were coming down, apparently nervous about the upcoming meeting. They entered the living room together. Percy looked pale and tense, and Jillian was just behind him, her face a mask of indifference, but I could see her fidgeting nervously with the hem of her blouse. Come in, I said, pointing to the couch across the hall. You remember Gilbert, don't you? Of course. Percy shook hands with the lawyer. Hello, Mr. Nivens. Jillian just nodded without extending her hand. So, I began as they sat down, I've invited you here because I want to discuss some changes I've decided to make to my will and other documents. Percy tensed even more, if that was even possible. Jillian maintained an indifferent look, but her eyes glittered with curiosity. As you know, after the ring incident, I asked you to move out within 2 weeks. I continued. That request still stands, but there are other changes that will affect you directly. I took from the table one of the documents Gilbert had prepared. Until recently, my will was standard. Upon my death, the entire house, savings, and other assets were to go to Percy as my only child and heir. Jillian pitched forward, her indifference beginning to crack. However, I paused, after recent events, I have decided to change my will. As of today, my home and all of my possessions will be donated to the local animal shelter. Pause of hope upon my death. A dead silence hung in the room. Percy and Jillian stared at me with their mouths open, clearly not believing what they were hearing. What? Percy finally said. The animal shelter? Yes, I nodded. It's an organization that Albert and I have always helped. They do a wonderful job of rescuing stray animals, finding them new homes. But, it's supposed to be a joke. Jillian laughed nervously. You can't seriously think about leaving everything to the dogs and cats instead of your own son. Totally serious. I looked her straight in the eye. And the papers are ready. Gilbert will confirm that I'm acting in my right mind. Gilbert nodded. Mrs. Hazelwood is fully competent and has the legal right to dispose of her property as she sees fit. Percy jumped up, his face contorted with anger and pain. Mother, you can't do this. It's not fair. Unfair? I raised an eyebrow. Was it fair to take the ring off my sleeping mother's finger? Was it fair to put loans in my name without my knowledge? Was it fair to take advantage of my kindness and support for years and then betray me? Percy sank back down onto the couch as if the air had been sucked out of him. It was a mistake, he whispered. We've already apologized. Apologies don't erase betrayal, I replied. They don't restore trust. Jillian jumped up suddenly, her face red with rage. You can't do this. This is your son, your flesh and blood. You can't disinherit him because of one mistake. One mistake? I shook my head. No, Jillian, it wasn't one mistake. It was the last drop in a cup that had been filling for years. I turned to Percy. Since you moved here, I've put up with disrespect, manipulation, theft of my personal belongings. I've turned a blind eye to a lot of things because you're my son, and I hoped you'd come to your senses, but you chose a different path. I didn't steal from you, Percy exclaimed. It was little things like those silver spoons. He paused, realizing that he had spoken out of turn. So you knew about the spoons, I nodded, and the brooch Albert had given me for our 20th anniversary, and the other things that had disappeared in the last few months. It's Jill, he muttered. I didn't know until it was too late. Percy! Jillian was indignant. How can you? Stop lying, Jill. He turned to her. You said they were just old things no one wanted, that we deserved them more than she did. And you believed it. I looked at him sadly. Believed that the jewelry and things your father had given me with love were no one's business. Percy lowered his head. I didn't think... Exactly, I interrupted him. You weren't thinking. You were just following her, letting her make decisions that were destroying our family. Gilbert coughed delicately. Perhaps I should wait outside while you discuss family matters? No, Gilbert. I put my hand on his shoulder. Stay, please. I want you to be a witness. After Gilbert's visit, the house fell into a tense silence. Percy and Jillian spent most of their time in their room, coming out only when necessary. I could hear them talking quietly, sometimes raising their voices to an angry whisper, then quieting down again. They were on the phone, probably looking for a new place to live or borrowing money. Several times I noticed Percy sitting alone on the veranda, looking out at the garden with a look of deep thought on his face. My decision to change the will and disinherit Percy had obviously shaken them more than asking them to move out. They had seemed to expect that they could somehow persuade me to let them stay, or at least to provide financial support. Now they were faced with the reality that they were truly on their own. The day after my conversation with Gilbert, I noticed the first signs of packing. From their room came the sounds of furniture being moved, the creaking of suitcases being opened. Percy had come downstairs several times with boxes, which he stacked by the front door. They hadn't asked my permission to take anything from the house other than the things they'd come with, and I was grateful for at least that small show of respect. Jillian avoided me like the plague. When we happened to run into each other in the kitchen or in the hallway, she would press her lips together and walk past without saying a word. Her eyes, however, spoke for her, so fierce that I was reminded of the old saying, "If looks could kill." Toward evening of the third day, Percy knocked on my bedroom door. I was reading in a chair by the window when I heard his tentative knock. "Come in," I said, putting the book aside. Percy opened the door but didn't come in, as if he were afraid to cross the threshold. "Mom, can I talk to you?" I nodded and pointed to the second chair across from mine. "Sure, sit down." He cautiously walked over and sat down, looking awkward in the room that had once been so familiar to him. As a child, he liked to climb into bed with me on weekend mornings, when Albert had already gotten up to work in the garden. We'd read books together, make up stories, just talk. When did it stop? When did that wall of alienation grow between us? "We found an apartment," Percy said, looking down at the floor, "on the east side of town. It's not very nice, but it's all we can afford right now." "I'm glad you found a place to live," I replied sincerely. "A colleague of mine at the firm lent us some money for the down payment," he continued. "We'll move in tomorrow morning. Jason, another lawyer from the office, had promised to lend us his truck." I nodded, not knowing what to say. Part of me was still hoping for some kind of breakthrough in our relationship, some kind of sincere remorse that could be a bridge across the chasm that separated us. But Percy wasn't apologizing. He simply informed me of his plans, as if I were the landlady and not his mother. "Do you need help moving?" I asked, surprising myself with the suggestion. Percy looked up at me in surprise. "No, we're fine, but thanks for the offer." There was silence again. Outside the window, the evening sun was painting Albert's roses a golden color. In this light, they looked almost unreal, like in the paintings of the old masters. "Are you really going to leave everything to the animal shelter?" Percy asked suddenly, his voice tense with barely contained resentment. "Yes," I answered firmly. "Not until I see a reason to change my mind." "What reasons would convince you?" He looked me in the eye. "What do I have to do to prove I deserve your trust again?" I wondered. It was a good question, and I wasn't sure I had an answer to it. "I don't know, Percy," I admitted honestly. "Trust is a fragile thing. It's easy to break and very hard to rebuild. It's a process that takes time." "And if there is no time?" His voice trembled. If you die before I can prove I've changed?" The thought of death didn't scare me like it used to. After Albert left, I'd learned to face my own mortality with a certain calm. "Then your motivation to change yourself would be wrong," I answered. "You should want to better yourself for your own sake, not for the sake of the inheritance." Percy lowered his head, and I noticed his shoulders shudder slightly. Crying? This grown man, my son, whom I'd almost stopped recognizing over the past year? "I just don't understand," he said quietly. "Why are you so angry right now?" "Yes, Jill and I did something stupid with the ring, but you know we were desperate. We would have gotten it back." "It wasn't just the ring, Percy." I shook my head. "That was the last straw. But before that, there were months and years of petty betrayals, disrespect, manipulation. I never meant to hurt you, Mom." "I know, but you let it happen. You stood by as Jillian slowly pushed you away from your family, from me. You chose the path of least resistance." Percy was silent, apparently considering my words. Finally, he asked, "When do you think things started to go wrong? When did I start to disappoint you?" It was a deep question that made me think. When exactly did my son begin to distance himself from me? When did our relationship start to deteriorate? "I think it was gradual," I said after a long pause. "Not just one moment, but a series of small withdrawals. Maybe it started when you went away to college and hardly ever called home. Or when you moved to Philadelphia and we only saw each other for the holidays. And not always." I remembered how much I missed him in those years. How Albert and I would sit by the phone on his birthdays, waiting for a call that sometimes never came. How I sent letters and packages of homemade cookies that he barely bothered to acknowledge receipt of. But I'd say the real change started after you married Jillian. Percy sighed. Jill had nothing to do with it. It's my decisions, my fault. Yes and no, I countered. Of course you made your own decisions, but Jillian had a lot of influence over you, and she never hid her attitude toward my father and me. Do you remember the first time we met? Percy nodded, his face taking on a thoughtful expression. I remembered the day Percy had brought Jillian to meet us. It was only a month before their wedding. That fact alone spoke volumes. They'd come in her new car, expensive and shiny. Jillian was dressed like she was going to a fashion show, not a family dinner. She looked around our house with barely concealed disdain, wrinkled her nose at the smell of the homemade baked goods I'd been making all day, barely touched her food. She said your house was charmingly old-fashioned, Percy remembered with a wry smile. I remember Papa choking on his wine. Yes, I nodded. Albert always saw right through people. He knew right away what kind of person she was. He was against our marriage. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. He was worried about you, I corrected gently. He saw that she wouldn't bring you happiness, but he also respected your right to make your own mistakes. Percy stared out the window at Albert's roses, now almost hidden in the dusk. He was right, he said so quietly I could barely hear him. As always. I didn't comment on that admission. Instead, I continued. After you were married, you started coming even less often. Calls turned into short, formal conversations. You were always in a hurry, always busy. I had a new job, a new life. Of course, but there's always time for family, if it's important to you. Percy didn't answer. We sat in silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. It was completely dark outside the window, and I got up to turn on the table lamp. Its soft light created a cozy circle in the corner of the room, leaving the rest of the space in semi-darkness. And then Daddy died, Percy said, looking at the old picture on the dresser where the three of us, me, Albert, and little Percy, were laughing in front of the lake. Yes, I nodded. And you came for 2 days. Jillian hadn't even bothered to come to the funeral. She had an important meeting with a client, Percy answered automatically. But there was no conviction in his voice. More important than your father's funeral? I couldn't keep the bitterness out of my voice. The man who loved you unconditionally all these years? Percy lowered his eyes. I know it sounds awful, but at the time, it seemed like a reasonable explanation at the time. Because you let her convince you of that, I shook my head. You always let her decide for you, even when her decisions went against your own values. She's my wife, he objected weakly. And I'm your mother, I replied. And Albert was your father. Family isn't just husband and wife, Percy. It's a bond that stands the test of time and hardship. We were silent again. Outside the window, the rain began to drizzle, its quiet, rustling on the roof providing a peaceful backdrop to our conversation. I've been calling more often since Dad died, Percy said, as if trying to defend himself. Yeah, for about a month, I agreed. And then I got distant again, and when you were in trouble, when you got laid off and had nowhere to go, you remembered me. It sounds like I used you, his voice was full of pain. Didn't you? I looked him straight in the eye. You showed up when you needed something, and you disappeared when you got what you wanted. Percy lowered his head, unable to hold my gaze. I didn't mean for it to be like this, he whispered. I was just confused. I know, my voice softened. I don't think you did it on purpose to hurt me. But it didn't change the outcome. Percy looked up at me, his eyes full of tears. Can it be undone? Not for the inheritance, but for us? Our family? I wanted to say yes, to give him hope that it could be undone. But life has taught me that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. At least not the way they were. I don't know, Percy, I answered honestly. But the first step is to recognize the problem. And it looks like you've started to do it. He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand like he used to do when he was a kid. We're leaving tomorrow anyway, he said. I think we both need space and time to figure things out. I agree, I smiled weakly. Sometimes distance helps you see things more clearly. Percy stood up, shuffling awkwardly from foot to foot. Thank you for talking to me, Mother. And thank you for being honest. I stood up too, suddenly feeling the weight of my years. Take care of yourself, Percy. I think about what's really important to you. Not for Jillian, not for me, but for you. He nodded, and after a second's hesitation, he stepped forward and hugged me awkwardly. It wasn't like the hug I'd had before, warm, free, full of love. It was tense, a little awkward, like we were almost strangers. But it was a beginning nonetheless. When the door closed behind him, I sank back into my chair, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. This conversation may not have changed anything about our situation, but at least we had finally told each other the truth. The next morning, I was awakened by the sound of a motor under the windows. When I looked out, I saw a small truck parked outside the house. Percy and an unfamiliar man, apparently Jason's coworker, were loading boxes and suitcases into the back. Jillian was standing nearby, giving instructions on where and how to place things. I didn't go downstairs to say goodbye. Yesterday's conversation with Percy had been a kind of farewell, and I didn't want to spoil it with a scene with Jillian, who was apparently in a bad mood. From the window, I watched them finish loading. Percy looked back at the house several times, as if searching for something or someone. Maybe he was hoping I'd come out, but I stayed in my room, hiding behind the curtain like a ghost of my own past. Finally, all the stuff was loaded. Jillian got into the cab of the truck, slamming the door harder than necessary. Percy stood on the driveway for a moment longer, looking at the house, then walked slowly to the car. When he was about to open the door, he suddenly looked up and looked right at my window, as if he knew for sure I was there. Our eyes met across the glass in distance, and he nodded slightly. Not a goodbye, more an acknowledgement that something had changed between us. The truck touched off, leaving a cloud of exhaust behind it, and slowly disappeared around the corner of the street. They were gone, really gone. I sank down on the bed, suddenly feeling empty around me. The house that had seemed cramped yesterday from tension and unspoken resentments now seemed huge and humming. I was alone for the first time in almost a year. It was a strange feeling. When Albert had died, I had grieved, but I had never felt truly alone. His presence remained in every corner of the house, in everything he touched, in the garden he had created with such love. But now, with Percy and Jillian gone, I felt not grief, but a strange emptiness, as if not only their things had been taken out of the house, but also a piece of his soul. I forced myself to get up and go downstairs. I had a new day to start, and I wasn't going to waste it feeling sorry for myself. In the kitchen, I found a note magnetically attached to the refrigerator. Mom, thank you for the roof over your head during a difficult time. I know we didn't live up to your expectations, and for that I'm sorry. I left my keys on the hallway table. Percy. The handwriting was hurried, as if he'd written the note at the last minute, probably while Jillian was already sitting in the car. No loud promises to change his life, no fervent apologies. Just a short, understated acknowledgement of what had happened. I made myself a cup of coffee and went out onto the veranda where I like to sit in the mornings. Albert's roses were already beginning to open, welcoming the new day. I stared at them, thinking about my decision to change my will. Was it right? Was it too cruel? Had I acted out of revenge or resentment? But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became of my choice. It wasn't about punishing Percy. It was about giving him a chance to find his own way, to become his own man, to free himself from Jillian's influence and dependence on my support. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is to let them face the consequences of their decisions. And the animal shelter was really doing important work. Albert always supported them, and I knew he would have approved of my decision. Maybe someday, if Percy really changes, I'll reconsider the will. But not now. Right now, he needed time and space to sort himself out. Aya finished my coffee and went back inside. In the living room, on the mantelpiece, were pictures of our family, Albert and I, on our wedding day. Percy in his graduation robe, all of us together at a picnic by the lake years ago. I stared at those pictures, trying to figure out when exactly we had started to drift apart, when the family ties that had seemed so strong had begun to crack and tear. Maybe it started when Percy was a child, when Albert and I overprotected him, solving his problems for him, or in adolescence when we couldn't find the right balance between freedom and control. Or in college, when we let him get away without teaching him the value of family ties? Or maybe it's just life, with its unpredictable twists and turns and difficult decisions. Maybe there's no one reason, no one moment when everything went wrong. Just a series of small choices that each of us makes day after day, and that ultimately shape our destinies and relationships. I gingerly picked up the picture of all three of us smiling against the lake and ran my finger over little Percy's face. No matter what happened next, no matter what path he chose, he would always be my son. And somewhere deep inside, I hoped that someday we could find our way back to each other. Not the way we had before. That would have been impossible. But maybe a new one based on mutual respect and understanding. I put the picture back up and went into the garden. The rose bushes needed tending, and I decided to do them today. Albert would be pleased. The first few days after Percy and Gillian left passed in a strange daze. I wandered around the empty house, listening to the creak of the floorboards and the ticking of the old wall clock that Albert loved so much. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps on the second floor or muffled voices in the kitchen, but it was only a play of the imagination, an echo of habits not easily broken. The room where Percy and Gillian lived was almost untouched, except for the absence of their personal belongings. I'd been hesitant to go in there for a long time, as if it were a forbidden space. But on the fourth day, something changed. I woke up feeling lighter and clearer than I had in a long time. After eating breakfast on the veranda, I went upstairs and resolutely opened the door to their former room. Sunlight flooded the space through the uncurtained windows, making visible the specks of dust dancing in the air. I opened the windows, letting in the fresh morning air, and began cleaning. First, I stripped the bedding and took it to the laundry room. Then I scrubbed the floors, dusted, and scrubbed the bathroom of traces of Gillian's makeup. With each movement, I felt the house become mine again, as if I were washing away not only the physical grime, but also the emotional residue of the past few months. By evening, the room was shining clean. I stood in the middle of it, wondering what to do with the space now. Turn it into a guest bedroom? But who would stay in it? I had almost no friends left to visit, and no relatives except Percy. And then it hit me. All these years I dreamed of a separate room for needlework and reading. Albert had always promised to give me one, but we had always put it off, first because of little Percy, then because of work, then because Albert was ill. There was always some reason to put my wishes on hold. But now, there was nothing stopping me from creating my own space just the way I'd always wanted it. Over the next few days, I set about transforming the room. I bought light blue paint for the walls, the color of the morning sky that had always calmed me. I hired a local handyman, Tom Murphy, to help paint and install bookshelves along one of the walls. Tom was a widower about my age, with the kind eyes and heavy hands of a man accustomed to physical labor. As we worked, we talked a lot. It turned out that he too had lost his spouse a few years ago, and understood well the feeling of emptiness that sometimes came over me. After Linda left, I thought I'd never learn to live alone, Tom said, gently running a brush across the wall. 43 years together and then silence. I understand, I nodded, handing him the painter's tape. Albert and I have been together for 50 years. Sometimes I still cook for two, or turn around to tell him something interesting. It never completely goes away. Tom smiled softly. But over time it gets, not easier, but different. Like they're still with us, just in a different capacity. These conversations brought a strange comfort. Tom wasn't trying to give advice or talk platitudes about time healing all wounds. He simply shared his experiences and I shared mine, and there was a healing power in that exchange. A week later, my new room was ready. Bright walls, a large chair by the window, bookshelves filled with favorite books, a craft table that now held my old sewing machine. This space reflected me better than any other room in the house. There were no ghosts of the past here, only the possibilities of the future. I began to spend a lot of time there, reading books I'd been putting off for years, embroidering and quilting, hobbies I dabbled in when I was younger but had abandoned because of family concerns. Each stitch, each page of the book was a small act of returning to myself, to the woman I was before I became a wife and mother. Not that I regretted these roles. Albert was the love of my life, and Percy, despite everything that had happened, was still my son, part of my heart. But now I realized that somewhere along the way I had lost Yvonne, a young woman with dreams and passions, a thirst for learning and creativity. And now I was bringing her back to life piece by memory. One day, going through old photo albums, I came across pictures taken during our honeymoon with Albert in Europe. We were so young, so full of energy and hope. In one of the photos, I was standing in front of the Eiffel Tower, smiling as wide as if the whole world belonged to me. I looked at that photo for a long time, remembering the sense of freedom and possibility that overwhelmed me then. Albert and I often talked about going back to Europe when we retired, spending months traveling through the small villages of Tuscany, visiting the museums of London and Paris, walking through the lavender fields of Provence. But then Albert fell ill, and all those plans remained dreams. After his death, I didn't even think about traveling. It seemed sacrilegious to enjoy the world without him. But looking at the photo, I suddenly thought, what if we went now? What if we fulfill our shared dreams, albeit alone? This thought kept me going for days. I started looking through travel brochures, researching itineraries, figuring out a budget. I had savings that Albert and I had put aside for our old age, and after he died, I hadn't spent much of it. Now that money had a purpose. But the mere thought of traveling alone still scared me. I wasn't sure I could handle the logistics, the language barrier, or just the physical aspect of such a trip. At 73, I was still in good shape, but I was still not a 20-year-old girl. Sharing my doubts with Tom during one of our tea parties, which became a regular occurrence after the work in my room was finished, I received some unexpected advice. Why not join a group tour? He suggested. My sister recently traveled to Italy with a group of retirees. She says it was very convenient. All the transfers are organized, guided tours, and most importantly, the company of people your age. The idea seemed reasonable to me. I started researching tours for older travelers and soon found a company that specialized in just such trips. Their fall tour of France looked particularly appealing. 2 weeks covering Paris, the Loire Valley, and Provence, with comfortable hotels and a leisurely pace. I made the booking feeling a mixture of apprehension and excitement. It was a big step, the first serious trip without Albert, the first independent decision of this magnitude in years. But with each day bringing me closer to departure, I felt a growing confidence. I'm going to make it. I will enjoy this journey for both myself and Albert. But Europe wasn't the only change in my life. Remembering my promise to help the Paws of Hope Animal Shelter, I called them and offered my volunteer services. I was welcomed with open arms. The shelter was always short-handed, especially for the elderly animals who rarely found new homes. Twice a week, I would come to the shelter and spend several hours walking dogs, brushing cats, just sitting and talking with animals who needed human attention. This work brought me unexpected satisfaction. The animals didn't judge, didn't ask difficult questions, didn't remind me of past wrongs. They simply accepted care with gratitude expressed by purring or wagging their tails. I became especially attached to an old pug named Barney. He was 12 years old, and the chances of anyone wanting to take him in were minimal. He spent most of the day napping in his cage, but when I came over, his eyes would light up and his short tail would wag frantically. "He's just waiting for you," said Carol, the shelter director. "He literally sits at the door on the days you visit." I would take Barney on my lap, stroke his gray face, and tell him about my life, my garden, the books I was reading. He listened so attentively as if he understood every word. One day, coming home after a particularly long day at the shelter, I realized I couldn't leave Barney there any longer. My house was too big for one elderly woman, and there was room in it for an elderly dog. The next day, I did all the necessary paperwork and took Barney home. The adaptation was not as smooth as I expected. Barney, used to the noise and bustle of the shelter, was nervous at first in the quiet of my home. He followed me around, whined when I left the room, and refused to sleep on the cot I'd bought just for him. Instead, he would climb up on my bed and curl up at my feet. But gradually, we found our rhythm. Morning walks in the garden among Albert's roses became our ritual. Barney sniffed every bush, sometimes lifting his head as if he too was enjoying their scent. Then we'd eat breakfast, me at the table, him with his bowl beside me. During the day, when I was reading or doing crafts in my new room, Barney napped on the pillow I had placed by the window for him. In the evenings, we watched old movies. I found Barney especially liked musicals, his ears twitching amusedly to the music. And at night, he slept beside me, his warm body and steady breathing chasing away the loneliness of the night. You know, Barney, I told him, scratching behind his ears, you and I are perfect for each other. Two old men who found each other at just the right time. He gave me a look of unconditional love that I couldn't help but smile back. With Barney's arrival, the house came alive again. There were sounds, the tapping of claws on the parquet, the quiet snoring in his sleep, the occasional joyful barking when Tom's car pulled up to the house and he became a frequent visitor. Barney adored Tom, perhaps sensing in him a soul as lonely as his mistress. You have a talent for finding lost souls, Yvonne, Tom said one day as he watched Barney enthusiastically sniff his shoes. Or they find me, I replied with a smile. Time flew by. It was fall, and Albert's roses were beginning to prepare for their winter slumber. I spent a week covering the bushes, trimming dry branches, preparing the garden for the cold. Barney sat patiently by my side, sometimes trying to help by digging up the soil around the bushes, which wasn't always helpful, but always fun. And then came the day of my departure for France. Barney was to stay with Tom, who had moved into my house for the duration of my absence. I was worried about my elderly friend, but Tom assured me that he would follow all instructions and spoil Barney as much as I did. We'll manage, Yvonne, he said as he helped me with my suitcases. And you enjoy the trip. You deserve it. France was beautiful. The fall colors made the scenery even more picturesque, and the lack of summer crowds allowed me to enjoy the sights at my own pace. The group I was traveling with consisted of 12 people about my age, many of whom were also widows or widowers. We quickly found common ground, sharing stories of our lives, comparing photos of children and grandchildren, laughing about common aging issues. I became especially good friends with Eleanor Pratt, a former literature teacher from Portland. She was 76 but had more energy than some young people. She had traveled the world since she retired 15 years ago, and she had an endless piggy bank of stories of adventures in all sorts of places. You know what I realized, Yvonne? She told me one evening as we sat on the balcony of our hotel in Provence, watching the sunset over lavender fields. Life doesn't end when those we love leave, it just becomes different. And at our age, we can still find so much wonder in this world. I thought these words as I stood on a hill in Provence, the wind playing with my gray hair in a landscape so beautiful it took my breath away. Do you see it, Albert? I asked mentally. And somewhere deep inside I felt his answer. Yes, honey, I can see it, and I'm so happy for you. When I returned home 2 weeks later, I felt refreshed. Traveling had given me not only new experiences, but also a new perspective on the life that was still in front of me. No matter how many years I had left, I was going to live them fully, without looking back, without getting stuck in regrets about what could have been. Barney greeted me as if I'd been gone for years, not weeks. He jumped around, squealing with joy, and then wouldn't leave my side for a long time, as if he was afraid I'd disappear again. Tom was happy to have me back too, though he was more reserved. He had become an important part of my new life. Not a romantic partner, but a close friend with whom I could share my joys, my sorrows, and the ordinary moments of life. The winter that year was mild with occasional snowfalls and sunny days. I spent a lot of time in my art room working on a large quilt I had started before the trip. It was a gift for the Paws of Hope shelter, a patchwork quilt with images of dogs and cats, symbolizing the warmth and comfort each creature deserved. Barney often lay at my feet while I worked, occasionally lifting his head to check on how things were going. His presence was a quiet reminder that even on the coldest days, the house was warm with love and care. In the spring, Albert's roses bloomed again, filling the garden with vibrant colors and fragrance. I spent hours tending them, talking to them just as Albert once did. Barney waited patiently nearby, occasionally lifting a paw to gently touch a petal, as if he too was communicating with the flowers. And then, almost exactly a year after Percy and Gillian left, I received a letter. It came by regular mail in a plain white envelope, addressed in my son's familiar handwriting. I sat with the letter in my hands for a long time, hesitating to open it. What could he have written? An apology? An explanation? A request for help? Or maybe good news that he'd found his way, grown stronger, wiser. Barney came over and laid his head in my lap, as he always did when he sensed my anxiety. His eyes, wise and full of understanding, looked at me without judgment or expectation. "What do you think, buddy?" I asked, scratching behind his ears. "Is it worth opening?" He blinked, and it seemed to me that there was more wisdom in that blink than in much human advice. I looked at the envelope again, turned it over, ran my fingers over the sender's name. Percy Hazelwood, my son, the man I'd known all his life and whom I might not have known at all. At that moment, I realized I didn't want to open the letter. Not now. Maybe never. Not because I didn't love Percy or forgive him. I loved him with all my heart and had long ago forgiven him for all the wrongs he'd done to me. But the last year had taught me to appreciate the present, to live in the here and now without looking back at the past or worrying about the future. I put the letter on the mantelpiece, next to the picture of all three of us, Albert, Percy, and I, smiling in another, simpler, happier life. Let it stay there as a reminder that some doors are best left closed, at least for a while. Perhaps someday I would be ready to find out what Percy wanted to tell me. But right now, my life was complete without that knowledge. I had my house, my roses, my faithful Barney. There were new friends and new hobbies, trips yet to be taken, and books waiting to be read. I stepped out into the garden where the afternoon sun goldened the tops of the roses. Barney trotted along beside me, his short legs tumbling funny over the gravel path. Somewhere in the back of the garden, I heard the clatter of a hammer as Tom repaired the old garden bench we liked to sit on in the evenings. Life went on, and it was beautiful in its simple, everyday beauty. I smiled as I lifted my face to the sun and felt the wind touch my hair like a gentle hand. "See, Albert," I thought. "I'm fine, I'm really okay.